Ready to go?
All right. Yeah.
Okay, guys, good morning. Just a quick introduction. My name is Sam McMillan. I'll be facilitating the synthetic ID panel here this morning. I'm with Experian out in the West Coast, Costa Mesa. So if I've got some red eyes, I got in at 1 o'clock this morning. I lead within our fraud and identity solutions business, I lead our technical sales team, technical sales engineering team. Going to quickly turn it over and just introduce the rest of the panelists, and then I'll tee it up and we'll get going.
Yeah, so Colin Carvey with TransUnion. I manage our identity solutions for TransUnion. Been in financial services for 20 plus years. I don't want to age myself too much, but really look forward to synthetics. Synthetics is a big passion of mine, and what we've had and what's happened over the last few years. So look forward to it.
Good morning. I'm Frank Mogollon. I've been in the industry for more than 20 years. I am the founder of Persokey. Before I started my company, I was with American Express for 13 years. In there, I was with the fraud for 10 years, I was the head of fraud for online identity theft and data breach detection. And I'm very excited to share with this great panel today. Thank you.
Hello, I am Jeffrey Feinstein. I am the leader of Analytics for LexisNexis Risk Solutions. Been in the industry for over 20 years as well, so I hope.
Yeah, another 20 years. Here, right?
So you have plenty of experience up here, over 100 years of experience. Before LexisNexis, I was at FICO, and I've been spending about the last 6 months working almost exclusively on the synthetic problem with my team.
And I'm Ken Miser. I run the identity services team at ID Analytics in San Diego. We are about a 15-year-old company that was formed specifically to solve identity fraud related issues, and recently acquired by Symantec. So we're really excited about sort of the bridge of digital and personal identity that's going to happen. This is another area that we're spending a lot of time, like Jeffrey said, on this. Our clients have been reporting a significant increase sort of in the presence of synthetics. We have some theories on why that's happening and some ways to handle it, and I'm kind of interested to hear what everybody else has to say.
Great, thanks guys. Just sort of teeing it up for a second or two. As we go through this morning, the concept of what the definition of it is sort of comes up all the time. So I Googled around a little bit and I'm like, what is an identity? You know, what does that mean? I think all of us deal with it every day, right? In our day-to-day work, and it's a representation of being oneself. And so I thought to myself, well, let me go take a look at what's authentic, right? What does authentic mean? And that's true and real. And then you go look at what's the difference, and you go say, what's a synthetic? And that's fake, imitate. So sort of trying to wrap our heads around what this really means, right? And I think for once, we've actually got it right in terms of understanding the definition of something that says this is a synthetic ID. So essentially, a fake imitation of being oneself. It's such an oxymoron, if you can put it that way. When you go Google, which is really interesting, you go just pick it up a little bit. What pops to the top is there's a band that was formed in San Francisco in 2011, Synthetic ID. And that's fact, right? And a real band. Go. And so then I kind of went in a little bit deeper. I'm like, what kind of music do these guys do? And well, punk pop, right? So I'm like, all right, synthetic ID, a fake representation of being oneself, and you're a punk. Well, I can kind of live with that, right? It sounds like that sort of fits together. But I think as we sort of kind of go through here and do the questions, right? There's some real key drivers as we look at synthetic IDs today, right? I think we'll probably hear this as we go through the panel, is understanding really what it is and how to define it, how to catch it, how to predict it, how to stop it, and what's driving it. Gartner suggests that 20% of all fraud losses can be attributed to that. 80% of all credit card losses today are attributed to that, right? And then lastly, the complete misuse of authorized users, right? So when you start sort of looking at some of the data that's related to that, and it's a real issue, and as we sort of go through the questions, and I'm just going to maybe hand it over to Frank to start off with the first question and say, Frank, what is, as you look at it from your perspective and what you deal with every day, how do you define synthetic ID in and of itself?
Thank you. Well, to be someone, you need to have a body, right? And that's a starting point, right? So if you think about what is happening today, we're using 1935 technology based on social security number, and as long as you pass the test of being a social security number, most companies start thinking that there is a body associated with that number. And we pass the times of that. So really, synthetic ID is basically a collection of data that is supposed to be somebody, but it's nobody behind it.
Ken, I don't know if you wanted to add on.
Yeah, sure. We sort of break this into three categories, right? So the classic form of identity theft is I pretend to be Jeffrey. We call that third-party fraud, right? The other version that we've seen a lot in specific industries, particularly telecom, is first-party fraud, where Ken is a real person, but Ken is a fraudster. The difficulty in the third-party fraud is exactly to Frank's point. There's no body, right? There is no, and consequently, there's no victim except for the enterprise, which makes punishing the malefactors a difficult thing because there's no victim. And what we're seeing is sort of a couple different variations within a synthetic, and the concept of the authorized user that you brought up early, I think matters. We refer to those frequently as curated synthetics. These are folks that people have put a lot of time and effort. It's the long con here to build a history associated with these identities. And if data repositories like ours show transactions and show history associated with it, there is an assumption that those identities are real. And then the other version of a synthetic that we see is something that we call a synthetic manipulator. And in this case, there might be a body behind that. It's me pretending and trying to confuse the system about who I really am. So it's somewhat a hybrid between that first-party fraudster and the third-party fraudster. But our experience with this and the analysis that we've done is that this is definitely the long con, and folks have been very, very patient about creating the paper trail, right? When I went to Catholic school, and when Sister told me that this was going to go on my permanent record, right? People are creating the permanent record.
Thank you. Colin, your side?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add to that, I think no biomatter, right, is the reference I make. There's no biomatter behind that entity and that identity that's created. I think from my perspective, when you think about synthetic, it's not just about the authorized users. I mean, these guys are creative, right? We all know in the fraud space that they're looking for opportunities. They have a business to manage. They're having a conference next door to talk about how they're going to beat us from the standpoint that they know we're looking at authorized users. They're ahead of the game. So when we think about it, it's not just about that authorized user piece. They're also using data furnishers. They're being very creative in creating synthetic IDs. But it's really, from our perspective in TransUnion, it's about that no biomatter behind it. Whether I'm mixing identity elements, and I agree with you from the standpoint of, there's kind of two types, which is, am I mixing identity elements? We've seen a case where we had linked very easily 10 identities into one person. And all he did was take his name, switch it around. So instead of Colin Carvey, it's Carvey Colin, and change the social by one digit randomly. And so they're being very creative in this process. But the definition and the way we think about it is there's no biomatter, yet there's some type of identity associated with it. And I think it's very important to understand that, because I think, as he referenced, like understanding how you think about first party versus third party, how you go about authenticating. If I'm going to authenticate somebody on a synthetic ID, they're going to pass, they created that identity. So it becomes very challenging on how you try and identify it, which is why I think we started this panel off with, how do you even define it? Because it is very difficult. And I think if you talk to any of us, there's going to be slight variations on how we identify a synthetic identity.
Jeff Owen.
Yeah, I think about it more from a signal detection point of view, to say that identities evolve in a certain way, and there are a range of identities for whom there aren't biomatter, and look for the signals that indicate that they're evolving, or their biography is very, very different. And when you look at it that way, you can really come up with different ways of defining and differentiating synthetics. And I think about it a lot by contrasting use case and method. So there's actually, I see at least 3 use cases. So when I say use case, I mean, what is a fraudster trying to accomplish? And there's the big headline version. That's the fraud scheme. Those are the ones that create thousands of synthetic identities, have that long game, and are ripping off companies. There was one, they're all in jail now, but they ripped off the financial services companies for somewhere upward of $200 million. Those are the easy ones. But when we look at the signal, that signal is conflated with other sorts of synthetics. So for example, there's a whole range of synthetics that are really just people that have really bad credit and say, you know, I don't want to wait the 7 to 10 years for my credit to remediate. I'm going to go over here and just make a new one. And hey, look, I'm clean. Suffice to say, they're not fraudsters in the intent sort of way. I think we can define them as fraudsters. They certainly have a significantly higher default rate than others. And then there's a third type, and these are those who, for one reason or another, cannot transact in the country. Think about immigrant populations or getting kind of out of financial services. You might get into felony populations. So there's kind of the use cases. And the problem is that they're all kind of mixing up the signal. And they're mixed in with all sorts of other signals of just standard delinquency or standard fraud, whether it be first or third party or whether it just be that a bank is misclassifying this as a credit fraud and therefore kind of doesn't treat it in their fraud bucket. There's also the methods. So there's a lot of ways to make it synthetic. Authorized user is certainly one of them. We see a whole range of dead people that kind of come back to life. There's a house in Michigan that has 30 or 40 dead people moving from all over the country and just transacting there. So there's actually Biomatter for that one. And we could debate whether or not that's
but yes.
you could actually call that identity takeover, right? Or, right? We refer to them as zombies. But so there's also CPN fraud, right? That's where you just kind of make up a social security number. You see if it's being used. Hey, it's not being used. There's no victim. Let's go forth. So there's all sorts of different ways. And the problem when you look at the signal level is they all have very distinct signals. But the good news is, so before this becomes a fear appeal about how synthetic identities are screwing up your portfolios, they all have kind of markers when you look at both their credit profiles as well as their non-credit profiles, because they're evolving in very, very unique ways compared to, say, a true identity.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, just to add on to that a little bit, because I think it's a really interesting topic as you think about defining and losses and how you look at it. Because when you think about those populations, right, and the population that we think about from the perspective of, you know, it's somebody that might actually be real, right, and they're manipulating the system because they have bad credit or they're new immigrants, et cetera. When you look at your books, and they charge off at a much higher rate, but not all of them charge off, right? So you cannot just look at that loss pattern that you've seen in the last year, because those guys are obviously higher risk, but you might not realize that risk for 5 years, right? Yep. Because they continue to manage, and some of them will continue to manage. So I think that's a very important thing, because a lot of folks you talk to, you just want to look at the loss. Yeah, I think you got to be really careful about just looking at that loss in the 12 months that you might go do a study, or even 14 months. Because as we see, and we're going to talk a little bit about this, the trend of the increase over time, we're in this for a long time, even if we stop it tomorrow. They're developing and building this out. It's the long con. If they're in the door, deciphering it becomes much more difficult.
Yeah, and I think you're at the ven of know your customer, fair lending, right? So it's a really easy thing to say, gosh, if someone just shows up on the radar and they're 37 years old, I'm not going to write them, right? Well, now you are potentially impacting an immigrant population or folks that are have managed to work their way out of a specific economic status that they're in, right? So our clients are looking and saying, I've got a know your customer requirement on the government side. I've got a fraud reduction requirement, and I've got a fair lending requirement, and I have to balance all of those. And sometimes the answer to one really messes up everything somewhere else. And so you have to be really, really careful and considered. And I definitely agree with what Jeffrey has said here, that there's these subcategories. And when we start talking about synthetic ID, we have to be really careful about defining the modality here. And in particular, I think one of the things that clients are learning is their need to tag these things better, right? You cannot stop this if you aren't tagging it. If you don't have a pattern to recognize to be able to stop the next one, because you haven't been keeping good records on what's been happening, you're gonna have a problem.
Yeah, maybe just sort of as we wrap up the question and jump to the next one, a lot of what we talk about is related to, is definitional. And I think that's the point, right? When you, in order to manage it, you have to have data points. In order to have data points, in order to tag something, you have to lean on the data points. And that's when we look at, as you look at synthetic ID, and I like the idea of the use case, we collectively call it intent, right? So there's the criminal intent, there's the intent of credit repair, and then there's the intent of the unbanked, if you want to call it. And those are the ones that we have to analytically be able to prove what the intent was when it comes to a synthetic ID. What's different on synthetic ID versus all the other fraud patterns we've had historically is that fraud and credit blend very closely here, in the sense that the losses for every organization plays out in their credit losses. And I think to your point, right, the tagging becomes really critical, and then be able to track the data that associates with those tags. And so we look at, as you look at synthetic ID, and you say, I've got to be able to, the intent's really key, and then you've got to say, well, how is this playing out? Never pay, it's a bust out, never contact is a really key one, because there isn't a bio body out there. And those are just some of the key sort of wraps as you look at synthetics and definitional. But I think it really comes down to, in order to tag it, you need the data. In order to need the data, you need to have a good definition around it.
I'm just going to say that part of the problem it really is because the whole system works with Social Security numbers. And when they created it back in 1935, they were created for a different purpose, right? So but the whole thing, you need employment, you need social. You need to get a phone line, you need social. You need to open an account, you need social. It became an identity, de facto identity, right? In fact, in 1972, those cards used to say, not for the purpose of identity, and then they remove it because it becomes a de facto. So we created this massive problem, and in fact, you know that the government actually don't provide a mechanism to say, hey, does this Social Security number goes with this name? We have to rely in the credit bureaus. Right. So, but the credit bureaus don't issue them. Right. So it doesn't make any sense.
The data is
So Frank, you're onto a great one, right? So you're onto question 2 here, right?
Yeah.
How did we get here? This is the question, right? That I think we're all sort of grappling with is how did we actually get here? And so Frank's jumped us on the question, but I'll allow him to do that.
There's
Jeff,
a
why don't you
really
jump into that a
interesting
bit?
macroeconomic trend that totally relates to what you're saying. And so if you go back to the 1990s and you just look at how identities emerge, so when they're first seen, the typical biography of a consumer in the 90s was that they'd get a voter registration or a driver's license or some other thing. In other words, they turn 16, they turn 18, they somehow register with the system, and there's your identity. And then slowly they build up a credit profile. I'm talking about their first evidence. If you look through, sometime around the late 90s, early 2000s, you see a dramatic change. So first of all, you don't see an overall increase in identities emerging. But what you do see is a decrease in that first record being, say, a driver's license or a voter registration, and you see increasing evidence that the first piece of data is a credit bureau report, right? And you actually see credit bureau emergence ticking up, and you see non-credit bureau or alternative data or behavioral data, whatever definition you want to use, public record data, that first record going down. In 2011, this gets to your Social Security point. In 2011, they passed Social Security number randomization. So what they really did is they made it much easier to just make up a number, right? Because there's no basis of fact in that Social Security number because there's a lot of information in there. So for example, before that, I could tell when that Social Security number was issued. I could say where it was issued. So if you say you lived in Iowa, I could say, hey, look, they have a Social Security number, or their parents lived in Iowa, or something along those lines. Looking at only credit bureau emergence, because that's where you're going to see the synthetics, because they're manipulating the credit bureau system or the credit data system. And I mean nothing, I mean, it's just the process. They're manipulating credit, right? You see a 50% increase. This is a pattern that's been stable since the 1990s. You see a 50% increase in identities coming in through credit bureau reports. Now, I can't say that that's all synthetic. In fact, I'm sure it isn't.
It's well, I think, enumeration at birth
Right.
and things like that. I liken this to, and that the Social Security Administration had a number of reasons to do randomization, some of which were good, some of which were responding to hyperbole. But in many cases, I analogize this to people were getting mugged in Central Park because there was this signal, right? The lights were on. So what the city decided to do, the Social Security Administration decided to do, was to turn off the lights in Central Park so that the bad guys couldn't find their victims. And it didn't work. It's just been completely screwed up, right, by this. And so one of the things that we think would help tremendously on this issue is if SSA would just reinstate some ability for people to understand not necessarily the geographic distribution and the ability to sort of reverse engineer a social security number, but if they would just tell everyone whether or not this is a valid or an invalid social, or whether this is a valid or an invalid block and group, area and group number. And if we knew that, then you could look at, prior to the 2011 randomization, folks like us had heuristics in place to be able to go, that's not a real social security number because it has not yet been issued. And it was one mechanism of authenticating things. But that signal got completely lost in the change to randomization. And the SSA looks at you and goes, I don't see what the problem is. It's just ridiculous.
And
just
also
to
they're
add on-
recycling the numbers too, because
no, they do not. They do
Well,
not.
I have a friend who's Russian. It got a credit report of 700 something because she got 100 years old social reassigned to her.
They have not. They will tell
don't
you
think
that they
they're
do not recycle numbers.
Well,
Well, only 35% of possible Social Security numbers have been used.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Right,
I think, and just to add to that from the perspective of, what we're doing, because everybody's like, well, why don't they do that, right? We have been, including Experian, we've talked to and continue to work with some of the government entities to try and figure out how we try and solve for that problem. But the interest is not high. It is not a priority. It's not a priority for the government. It's not a priority from that standpoint, which I think brings it back to, and I think we'll get into this again, which is what do we do? Because I think the likelihood of that happening, at least in the next 5 years, is next to nil. And I think we've got to figure out then, as an industry, even as a government, because I'll tell you, and we'll get into this a little bit later too, this isn't just a credit problem. This is not just a financial services problem. This crosses over everything. I mean, we've seen identities that are being used, synthetic identities that are being used associated with child support felonies. They're using this identity beyond just trying to take $100,000 from it.
Yeah, you guys,
go ahead.
you guys have done. I've been on a panel with folks from you guys, and let me talk about my competitor here. But you guys,
Please do.
we've had this conversation before about sort of, and this is not a space we're in, but the government benefits space, right?
So we see it in the government benefit space. We see it in staged accidents. So we have a relatively large insurance business. And basically we see it in cases where there's an advantage to transacting under a different identity. Something we're looking at now, for example, are registered sexual predators who can't get access to certain, say, occupations that could very easily create a synthetic identity and then engage in those things that they're blocked from.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen felonies who can't get rent a place because they're a felony, right? And so people do credit checks. They use synthetic identities to be able to get in that space. So, this can impact all of our lives because they could be living next to you, right? I mean, so again, the fear factor,
Right.
but it is a little bit scary when we look at some of the behavior of these identities.
Just a thought on the bureau side, because I think it's important, and I think Ken touched on it earlier on, right? When you're in the space of the financials, and that could be, you've got your customer, your CIP. The regulators are saying that, right? And then the second part is a fair credit, right? It's a fact of life for us, and as we look at data, it's data coming in, right? We're getting reported data, and what becomes really critical in this aspect is being able to delineate between good reporters, intermediate, and bad reporting data. And I think as you sort of look at the industry we're playing at, specifically in the financials, where there's money being lent or a financial liability being made, it becomes really critical from looking at this data that the qualitativeness of that reporting agency is taken into account. I think as you sort of go, and this sort of goes to the next question that we talked about, is this just a financial issue? Colin, what do you think? Or is it, and we sort of touched a little bit on it, it sort of broadened out on what Jeff just talked about.
Yeah, no, I think a great question. I think I was starting to get there, which is this is not just a financial services problem. When you look at this from benefits perspective on the government side, we see that. When I think about the rental industry and renting houses, it's a problem there. We've continued to see this up, and some folks even on the financial services side will say it's a credit card problem. That's not the case. We've seen these guys continue to take auto loans. I'll give one quick example too where we've seen this. So we saw this identity, we connected it. I talked earlier about Colin Carvey versus Carvey Colin. There was 10 identities with this person, right? We found their real identity. But in all the other 10 identities that we looked at, they had other felony type activities or claims against them. Not all of them, but some of them, right? From the association with, past alimony, whatever it was, there was association with crimes that were there and tagged to that other identity, obviously using his identity. The interesting thing is when we looked at that real identity, and that was really scary to us, is the fact that he had a pilot's license with that. You think about some of the events that have happened in the past, that becomes a little bit scary. Like, what is this guy doing? We do believe there's a huge amount of terrorist fundraising, I'll call it, associated with synthetic IDs. It's very difficult for the government, and we're working with them to try and provide some exposure into this issue, because we do believe that this is not just a financial services problem, but is actually impacting us as a country from the perspective of the ability to fundraise and the national security. And so, there's conversations with Homeland Security, et cetera, on how do we try and solve that problem. I mean, this is a big problem. And when we look at some of the trending and the increase in where things are going, it's growing significantly. We look at and do data analysis on performance of what we would call, the startup activity of these accounts. The startup activity, where they're coming in and building this credit and is starting to establish it, is at a higher growth peak than the places that they're cashing out. And what does that mean? That's predictive of the future. Mm-hmm. The future of this is going to hit us pretty hard over the next coming years. They are attacking the space extremely hard.
I totally agree with that. I think it's just go beyond every single activity. You don't exist. Look, this is part of the problem. The illegal immigration, they don't exist in the system, or they exist with some synthetic ID. That's one problem. Other problem, our children, very vulnerable for this type of stuff, because if the fraudsters are trying just to figure out numbers, they're going to hit some of our children that have no credit history. And guess what? When that child goes and applies for credit, it's going to have a problem, right? Another problem. So we need to put our children into getting social security numbers as they're born, because we claim it as dependents in our tax, right? And another, national security or thin file. I came from Australia. When I came here, one of the problems, I couldn't get credit. And I have great credit in Australia. So cross-border, right? So people move from country to country, and they need to start fresh here. Right? Fraudsters abuse that. I saw cases where someone was from Dubai claiming to be royal. It was all BS, right? All BS. So and this is people who's trying to come into the country, open accounts, open credit lines, and launder money. So criminal activity, right? Terrorism, drug trafficking, all the bad stuff. We need to solve this problem.
So I think if you sort of, and Ken, I'll get to you in a second there. I think it's what's fact is that it sort of goes to the core of what we do every day. Whether you're lending money, or you're submitting a tax, whether you're a medical provider looking to prove yourself to be able to supply a prescription drug of some sort, it really does get to the core of who we are as U.S. citizens or U.S. People that live in this country. Ken, I don't know.
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree with everything that everybody has said. And Jeffrey sort of talked about this concept of sort of the evaluating the signal. And I think the good news in this, right, because we've been pretty dire about sort of what we're seeing here in many cases, there are still some ability for us to be able to differentiate the legitimate versus the non-legitimate transaction stream, right? People who apply and the arc of the creation of an identity still has a core set of behaviors that are around it, and things like velocity and things like commonality of addresses and contact information are still helping to stop a lot of this. That said, I was on a panel here in DC a couple months ago, and one of the folks from Postal Inspection talked about doing a raid at a house in Los Angeles, and they had a they did this raid, and in the house was an office, and there were bookshelves full of binders, and every when you open up a binder, there was plastic slipcover information in there that had credit reports and had SIM cards and had all sorts of other things like this. And there were like 14,000 different identities present in this one room, as an example. And then when the U.S. attorney was talking about this, when they went to go prosecute against this, because synthetic identities don't have a victim, like we talked about before, the penalty for identity theft, there's two. Aggravated identity theft is a 2-year count, and regular identity theft is a 1-year count. The United States Sentencing Commission guideline says there has to be a victim for aggravated identity. So the person who perpetrated this could not be charged, even though it was 14,000 cases of them in this room. The person who perpetrated this could not be charged with aggravated identity theft because there were not victims to be found.
Yeah, I think, and 2 points on that. I think what's interesting is the SIM card, right? I mean, they actually have phones associated with each individual person,
Right.
so they can pick up the phone. I think that was, I heard the same thing, right? It's
Yeah, that's
very
the first step.
interesting. I mean, that's pretty crazy from the perspective
Very good at what they
It's an
do.
investment.
what they're doing.
It's an investment,
I think,
a long con.
and another point along the same lines from the standpoint of prosecution. When we've seen these guys do it in the auto space, we saw somebody go down in one day with one identity that was synthetic down the East Coast and take 6 different car loans of $60,000, $70,000 cars, drive them off the lot. Again, that's organized crime because I'm not sure one person can drive 6 cars at the same time, right? But it's really, guess what? That's not auto theft. That's a financial services crime. Where does that go in the stack? All the way to the bottom. So the prosecution of this stuff is also very, very challenging. And I think that's a very good point.
And in many cases, it's written off, particularly on the card side, as a credit loss. We did a study a year ago or so where we looked at incidents of reported fraud and other activity that we saw associated with those identities for a 3-year period. About 40% of the time, there was another instance of similar account activity that had not been tagged as fraud by someone else. It had been reported as a credit loss. So if you're a victim of identity theft, one of the other things that happens is that you don't know all these other things that are happening to you. Let's assume that it's a third-party identity theft, and this is also true in the synthetics, is that most of the clients, or many of the clients, are writing these off as credit bads. They're treating it as a cost of doing business, and therefore it's lost in the system.
And I
And it's
think that's a
affecting the
real-
cost of
that's a-
funding too, because then the APR has to go up, right? But to your point, we did analysis that like that in Amex as well, and we found extremely high correlation, and it was not a credit problem, but we have to define something called first payment default, and we drive everything from first payment
But
default.
and that gets reported on the credit side.
Yeah, what's interesting is our risk models are actually better than we think they are. I mean, we all are critical of our risk models, but they're actually pretty good if we back some of this stuff out.
Right.
So I think if you sort of look, and then this is exactly the point, right? Historically, fraud has been fraud, and credit's been credit, and the synthetics more than anything is sort of colluding it together, which gets us to the next question. What do we do collectively as an industry to try to, understanding that we're probably all competing on a day-to-day for our clients, right? What do we do collectively as an industry to solve and I guess remediate this issue, right? And work towards an ultimate solution for it. Frank, what have you got?
Well, I think we need to look at the future. We're using technology that is actually 82 years old, but I think the credit bureau is doing an amazing stuff collecting data. The problem is there is a bad data in that data. So it's about using analytics, machine learning, and try to solve the problem from the data perspective. But as well, we need to think about new technologies, right? There's biometrics there, right? And there's blockchain, right? They start talking about, sovereign identity. And how can we create a model where, I can vouch for you if I know you, right? These are systems that have worked since the beginning of civilization, right? The best way to actually create trust in someone is that I got introduced by you, by someone you trust, right? These models are very difficult to implement and scale unless you have something like blockchain. So we need to start thinking about the next generation of technology that can help whatever great job the bureaus are doing with the data, because it's not going to be as easy problem to solve.
Yeah.
Well, let's,
So I think, sorry, just really quick. So I think I'm going to challenge that a little bit, because I do believe data and predictive models. You talk to anybody on this
I
panel.
love data. I love data. I think
I-
you need to put an extra layer.
Well, yeah, but let me take it a little bit further, because I think there is a lot we can do as a group, right? If you start asking that question, is what can we do as a group? And I think there's a few things, and it does actually support what you're saying, which is we can share data. And I think that's very important when we think about this: is how do we share data? How do you guys share data amongst each other on what you found to be synthetic, as an example, right? And then I think it's also us coming together on panels like this. I've participated in other panels as well in more government-oriented conversations, right? And I think us going and continuing to help and try and bring not just a financial services perspective, not just a credit bureau perspective, not just alternative data perspective, right? Not just a technology perspective, but all of us coming together, government, we've got it, everybody's got to come together if we want to solve this problem. And like I said, we need to do that now, because we're already going to be living with this for 5+ years. Right?
Maybe, Colin, just to add real quick on and I think where we look at it, there's clearly data and analytics play a massive role in solving for this, and there's no question about that. There's also the collective effort. In a perfect world, one bureau solves for the problem, but the other two don't. The problem's not solved. This is honestly the weakest link. It's, if you get down to the issue of the weakest link, it's absolutely an issue here. And then I think, sort of to Frank's point, as we look at it, you start getting into the management of identities, right? And an identity isn't the social. It isn't the bureau pin. It's significantly more than what it used to be. It's your social media. It's your email patterns. It's what you've got on your credit file. It's potentially what your geolocations is, how you come in and what devices you're coming in from. And this is starting to become the new identity versus just what we might have had 10 or 15 years ago. And I think as you look at this, data and analytics is really core to solving for this problem, in addition to sort of the collective effort by the industry.
and
I totally agree. I think that's right on.
I'd say you need measures of proof of life. So it's not enough just to see that a social security number is transacting. It's not enough to see that they're applying for credit cards or have credit cards and in fact pay them on time. Synthetic fraudsters don't have the time to register for and graduate from college. They tend to not get driver's licenses. They tend to have very, very restrictive social networks. So for example, they tend to not have parents. So these sorts of proof of life in addition, and I'm not suggesting one or the other, but it's this broader kind of data perspective. And we also have to be careful, because if you define a synthetic as an emerging identity, you also don't want to alienate the true emerging identity. So we could talk about the use of minor social security numbers. Well, minors are transacting under their social security numbers. They do apply for credit. They do get authorized user. Now, granted, they apply for credit when they're old enough. But we also don't want to shut the door so much that we kind of alienate these populations for, right? Yeah, for thin file and so forth. So it's really finding that broad data spectrum instead of focusing on, say, social.
I think the authorized user, and we sort of talked about that in an early context, but didn't necessarily get back to it. Do a Craigslist search when you go home to whatever city you're in, and do a Craigslist search on authorized user, and take a look at essentially solicitations that are being made for people to add other folks to their accounts. Right? Pay $1,000 to add somebody as an authorized user, and to essentially help me establish, or me helping someone else establish their credit, right? So the institutions, right? That we have a data problem, right? And part of the problem, and most of my clients would tend to agree that part of this is it's a marketing versus security or fraud, continued interchange. I was in insurance for a really long time, and underwriters and agents, always had this battle going on, and it's a very similar sort of thing going in this space, right? Marketing wants to grow the portfolio, and one of the ways to grow the portfolio is to add authorized users and to get more people transacting on those cards. I just added my kids on our cards, and literally it was as simple as going to the website and typing in a name. right? And the card comes to me, so there's not a lot of danger for me that someone's going to transact against that account. But there was no vetting done, essentially, of that account whatsoever. And so now that person who's an authorized user is gaining experience and essentially getting the value of my experience for a period of time.
Yeah, we heard about it because the Craigslist of work from home and make $1,000 a day. I mean, we had an example of that where somebody came in and complained because they called and they said, "Hey, you just took my livelihood away," because the policy was changed at one of our customers, right, where it changed from allowing unlimited authorized users to allowing 5 in a certain time period. They're like, "That's what I do for a living. Like that's how I make my money." She didn't see anything wrong with it. She's like, "I'm helping people with credit." Like she was not aware of what activity she was doing, and I find that really interesting as we look at the economy that this has created. I mean, really, which is what it is. I think the interesting part for me as I look at like how do we try and go through that process of identifying this is the other thing we're doing is if you think about the financial services space, insurance, et cetera, I could extrapolate that out. We're actually soliciting these guys because they look good. The marketing teams want them on their books because this is a great identity, and they're out there and they're doing nothing from the perspective of doing it in the pre-screen. Like you should screen them out. Like why would you mail that person when you could go and spend that money on mailing somebody else?
So Colin, maybe I want to open it up for some questions to the audience, but I think that's the other sort of, if you sort of take away is the challenge between detection and the consumer, right? Because consumer today is king, right? And more often than not, when we're having a fraud conversation, we're in the same conversation with the digital marketing team, and that balance is really the one that I think you sort of address. So, wanted to open up for some questions to the audience there.
Hi. Randy Schaefer, a consultant, done a lot of work in payments for major bank, authentication. My sense, I'd like a reaction, is the conflation of credit and fraud seems to be doing a massive disservice to analytics. And I understand that the net result of write-offs is the same, but different techniques to solve the problem. If you stop the first, you certainly prevent the second. And is that the way your organizations really look at it, or are you just simplifying it up here?
I'll
Take
get,
it. Sure. I agree with you. I think that Fredit is definitely a thing, and we've begun to see. We've traditionally said that our fraud issues were our fraud solutions were non-FCRA, and that our credit solutions fell in the FCRA, partially because we had this experience data set that we didn't want people to be able to fraudsters to come be able to challenge whether or not I needed to keep that bad transaction in the system because the model relied on that to recognize the anomaly, right? We are seeing more and more that our clients are starting to ask for actionable fraud solutions because this really is the signal exists on both sides. Things like the authorized user, one of our clients has definitely, as an example, said one of the things they look for is when they're evaluating an account is time on file is earlier or is later than date of oldest trade. And what that tells them as an example is that that they're riding on someone else's transactions as an authorized user, and so they're more careful, and that creates another set of rules and things like that. I think that there's some reluctance on our client side, and we're all, I think, very, very client driven, right? They set their fraud strategies, they set their credit strategies, and we live with the reporting that comes in as a consequence of that. And in some cases, the conversation that I just had about, or the example that I just mentioned of the credit write-offs being associated with frauds at other things, that was a decision that was made on that client's side about the fact that they were going to tag that as a fraud or a credit write-off, and they're used to reporting certain losses in that bucket, and to move them from bucket A to bucket B has some consequences for them from a financial reporting side as well. And so you'll see some resistance on people's sides to all of a sudden go from quarter to quarter and say, hey, guess what? It's just really a trade. My bad debt went down by X, but my fraud went up by Y. It's not something that's really that interesting for them to be able to go have that conversation with the street on that, right?
So Kim, maybe I would like to sort of just add, I think there's no question that the Fred, I kind of like that term, by the way, as it sort of comes together. It's very true, though, as I look at our organization, we're looking at very specifics in terms of data analytics that's different from a normal credit write-off. And there's certain particular patterns that we're seeing. I think we've talked very broadly, we've talked about authorized users, we've talked at the qualitativeness of the reporting agencies that we're working with, we're looking at the type credit lines, Jeff touched on that a little bit earlier on. Those are just three good examples of why it looks different. I think the reporting and the baselines, organizationally, and then down to the functional levels, right? Fraud may have had a loss of, let's just call it $2 million in an organization. Now, because of the change of this, some of this is sitting in credit losses. Suddenly, the fraud loss looks dramatically different. It is just sort of passing it across. But there's substantial sort of regulatory pressures when you're reporting fraud versus a credit loss. And I think we are looking very specifically at data points that's unique to this versus a normal credit loss.
So specific to the analytics question, as someone, I mean, I run the analytics organization for my company. It's tempting to think of analytics as magic, right? And we say machine learning and artificial intelligence and deep learning are all increasingly more magical in their ability to solve problems, that you hit a button and a number comes out. But really, all analytics do is reduce data down to a picture. Right? So whatever your analytic solution is, it simply says that data pattern is there to indicate credit risk or credit fraud and so forth. So when we talk about analytics, there's actually huge opportunity. And I believe all of our organizations are doing that. And that is to find this new signal. And just based on our introductions, I would say that we're all working on finding that new signal. And I can tell you that we have methods that are now finding likely synthetic identities. And no, it's not the generic be-all fraud score. And in fact, no be-all fraud score will equally identify account takeover versus identity theft versus lost and stolen credit card. What we're really doing is saying, what are the signals associated with that, and can we distill it and make those signals available to the users of our products? Right?
Jeff, maybe just one thing, and then we'll turn. Sorry,
Sure.
Just one thing that we haven't touched on here, which makes it so. I think we've heard there's no silver bullet, right? I think that's what you were sort of
That's
saying
true.
there. But one of the reasons that there's no silver bullet is because the synthetic has a life cycle. So there's the creation of the synthetic ID, early phase creation. Then there is the establishing of the credit, right? And detecting that looks different than early stage. Then there's the transactional part of it, and then there's the behavior. I bust out, I don't pay. Right. And when you look at it across that life cycle, you have to apply different methodologies analytically, however you sort of put your layered approach on. But through that life cycle, it looks significantly different. So, sorry, I'm going to turn it over to the next question.
Let's talk about the issue of creating synthetic identities. I think that Frank had a great point saying that we're using social security as kind of like the basic for identities, and Jeffrey actually had an even better point when he said, hey, we started seeing the first signal of an identity around the early 90s. Instead of having driver's licenses or voter registrations, now it's at the bureau. And then I heard that the government is doing something, they did the randomization. So it's so simple and easy to point fingers at the government. Yep. But I think that we are not addressing what the weakest link in the chain is. At a panel yesterday, a lady from Ideology actually said it really clear. The issue is the bureaus. The bureaus are allowing the creation of identities in a very simple way. And they started that back in the 90s. I've been around probably longer than you guys. And I remember that the issue was, hey, let's get data, let's be the number one. And the competition was not about the quality of the data. It was not about information, it was about data. So I echo what the lady said yesterday at a panel, because I feel the same. I think it's so easy to create an identity at the bureaus, and you all know that. So my question, especially to you guys from the bureau, we got two in here and we got the other one over there. What are you doing to, if you doing anything to, number one, clean the data that you have, and number two, to really put some good controls about creation of identities?
Yeah, so I'll take, he pushed
You
it
want
on to
me?
me, the hard
Now,
question.
you want me here, or you want me to sit down? Because we can talk about this for a long time. Okay. And I'm not opinion. You know, I don't
No,
have
so-
strong opinions about the bureaus
so-
because I use them too in my business.
Yeah. So I'll answer a little bit from at least my perspective, and I think we share kind of the same perspective here. Like, and I think you brought up the good point, which is, historically, we have so tied identity to a social security number. You heard that. You heard that through the whole panel. That's the wrong thing to do. And I think that's what we're all after is the identity has become much more than the social security number. It's become this big data. And I think we are doing a lot. I mean, what we offer and the solutions we offer from that perspective to help you identify it is exactly what we're in business for. We're in business to help you understand the risk you're going to take. That's our business. We're not the identity company. That's not what we do.
But
we help you manage identity.
You have
a
become
de facto
the
identity
de facto
company.
identity company. Now, what
I
I'm hearing
understand.
is that that's the way we always done it, and we're gonna keep it the same way. But you know what? We also have tools that we can help you identify the issues that we created. But by the way, we're gonna charge you for that. That's what I'm hearing.
I think you have to ask, and by the way, not being from a bureau here, right? I think that there is validity to your criticism here, but I think that you also have to think about this of the bureaus and folks that take in this information are acting as repositories on behalf of these financial
Exactly
institutions, right? And so what is the consequence, or are we prepared for the consequence for Colin to turn around and say to Bank X, I'm not taking that record.
Right.
That's exactly
Ken, so
right.
if I can,
That's
I
exactly
think to your
That-
point, right?
That
there's-
will be the step in the right direction.
Right. Couple thoughts on this, right?
Yes, I think will be the step in the
Legally right now I
and-
can't,
and-
but-
and at least having certain mechanisms in there to really identify what a good identity is. Look, you know.
But, so let me just
finish my
hold you
point.
off for
Let me
just one
finish my
second.
point. Why is it so simple, for a bureau to take an identity based on a social security that you already have on record? Why do you create another identity or 3 or 4 or 5 different identities based on the same social security number?
Let me respond. So I think from the perspective, one is we have regulatory things that we have to do, that we are required by law to do. That is why we are working with the government to try and figure out how to solve for some of this problem. But we can't do it without the cooperation. I don't want to just push it off on government. That's why I talked about earlier about it is this team effort. That's why these conversations are really good, because we've got to be able to change the regulations and how things get reported and what we're required to do.
Nothing is changed.
So, Colin,
heard
can
the
I-
same
I
thing
think
in
if I can say
2000
something.
2006,
bureau.
I actually brought this up at a conference in Vegas.
I think it's
and
really
they told me the same thing.
So I
We're
think-
working on this. We're talking to the regulators. We are gonna make it better. It's already 2017 and nothing has happened.
So let me just sort of add a couple thoughts on this. First and foremost, there is a regulation, which it's the Fair Credit Reporting Act, right? And as a bureau, we're required to strictly follow that reporting act, right? So there's a part, if you're applying for credit, there's a process. There's a process to dispute it. There's a process to manage it. And then there's what you've got to get back and what you're required to get back. So that's one, right? So, and then there's the second aspect around this is around the reporting agency qualitatively, right? So if you sort of look at historically where we've come from, and just take the financial industry for a moment, and over the last 2 or 3 to 4 to 5 years, the type financials that we're starting to see sort of come up, right? And so there's a very strong angle that we've got to look at, and we're looking at that very closely, is to the type reporting agencies. Because essentially from a reporting agency perspective and a credit bureau perspective, we're taking inquiry and we're going to try to determine a credit score. So I think when we talk about it, I don't think there's any question about your point that what we're talking about from a bureau perspective is one aspect of it, but it's simply not the only aspect. And that's at least from my perspective.
Can I just say something? I think nobody likes synthetic IDs. The banks don't like them. You guys don't like them. The consumers are the victim. The enemy is the fraudster, right?
The fraudsters like
That's the enemy. So we have a common.
Fraudsters
we
love
have
them.
we have a common enemy.
think
That's what I'm saying.
that's-
So what I think is important is to understand that this is a problem that is not going to be solved by you guys only. We need the cooperation of the banks. We need the cooperation of the credit bureaus. We need cooperation of technology companies that are in blockchain, biometrics. We need to cooperate each other to solve this problem.
The only thing I can say.
So the answer is blockchain.
No,
All right.
good.
Who's up next?
Another question?
Any more questions? Oh,
Here comes Don.
back there. I'm not sure how our timing works, but we're
disclosure
we've got 3
moderator
minutes
of
to
the
go.
last panel I was on.
Kicked out.
Let him kick us out.
I'm really interested in this notion of how we can kind of change the ecosystem, including the regulators and the banks. And it really goes to this notion of signaling, which Jeff talked about, which is on one hand a competitive differentiator for you guys. But I was just wondering if there's an opportunity to exchange signals between competitors so that the ecosystem improves, particularly around synthetic identities, and how that framework might come about.
Yeah, so I'll talk about that a little bit just from the standpoint of the overall ecosystem and sharing. We as TransUnion ourselves are investing a ton of money and energy into how do we create more of that, I'll call it the sharing economy, right, when it comes to fraud. Because I think we talk to a lot of our customers, right, and they will tell us that fraud is not a competitive advantage. But getting them to share data continues to be difficult. I think we've made a lot of progress in this space. I think all of us have made a lot of progress in that space. And I think that's starting to change. So I'm very hopeful as we look at that and that sharing economy, because that, again, we all talked about that in the last conversation as well. There's a lot of effort coming into this. And there is a lot of progress. You look out over the last 2 years and the progress on this topic, I think is great. I don't think it's fast enough, personally. But I think that's the reality of the world we live in big banking and in big government, right? With those two things kind of handcuffing us a little bit, I think the amount of progress we've made in the last 2 years has been great. We have a long ways to go, but I think that sharing component and where that's going, that to me, I don't call it the silver bullet, but I think that is very impactful. So
Yeah, I can. It is absolutely critical to share. The issue is how do we break the barriers to sharing data, and I think you have a great point. Sharing data, you are exposing PII. You need to understand the liability when it comes to sharing that data. How do you mitigate that? Well, let's make the data shareable in a way that tries to solve the problem, but is not exposed to some other risks, right? I think technologies today can actually do that with things like blockchains, that can be out there, tamper-proof. These are technologies that are going to help us to actually be able to share data in a more useful way without getting into the risk that you're talking about.
he loves blockchains.
I do that.
And I would add that as a neutral company, we do share identity level information with the credit bureaus.
Yeah,
I would love
as-
to share it with.
Yeah, as do we, right? I mean, our business was built on a consortia, right? We've got n number of financial institutions and telcos and others that are contributing this. I think from a policy standpoint that one of the things that's going to have to change is and I'm not a big fan of additional regulation, but the paradigms of the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which describe exactly what needs to be reported and when it needs to be reported. We need a version, whether it's actual legislation or an industry agreement, to help come up with better definitions and better reporting requirements. Because frankly, today, we're all getting the same things, and that the way that we compete with each other is sort of what we do with the raw material that's been granted to us. And every day we're fighting it out, and some days I win, and some days others win. And so I think we're in favor of that sharing. But I think that what we need is some better rules for the road around this. And this goes back to the first thing that sort of got brought up is around definitional activities and tagging and the ability for us to follow up, right? So if Colin or others have an ability in the file to say, I'm not really sure that this is a great identity, their ability to reach back into the organization that provided them with that information and say, I need you to do additional research on this. That really just doesn't exist on the identity side. It exists in a great way on the payment and the transaction data side, but not on the identity side. And I think we need something.
Maybe I'd like to sort of add to that, and maybe then we can just wrap up. But so just a quick note on that. Every client that we work with today, and I would almost say about 85%, ask us, what is your ability to do sort of a consortia type data? And I'm sure sitting around the table here, everyone on the front here will say, we absolutely can do that. You know, from a technology perspective, from a data sharing perspective. But when you get to the reality of it, there is regulatory compliance constrictions. There's the type data that can and cannot be shared. And that sort of is one of the roadblocks. And I'd like to sort of add to your point, Ike, is that from an industry perspective, there's got to be a way of saying, how do you share this data? And it's because it's doable from a technology, a data perspective. It's a question of what's the regulations allow versus not, and then how do you get by the compliance hurdle? So let me,
And just to
Colin.
wrap it up a little bit along those lines, and we talked about synthetic, the problem we've got with that is that synthetic's not a top priority. Why? Because there's no victim.
right,
Right.
yeah.
I would favor that consortium as long as I don't have to be in the contract meetings.
Yeah. That's where we go. So I'm gonna wrap it up.
Authorize you.
I think I just wanted to say thank you to Ken and Jeff and Frank and Colin
Thank you.
for joining. Thank you for One World Identity for having us. We're going to be around if there's any questions. I think I'm going to sort of just sort of close out with a statement since we're just a block or four away from the White House, right? So from a classical JFK, right? There is a cost, right? And a risk of taking some action, but the cost of inaction is significantly more, right? And that's a classical JF Kennedy statement. And I think in this particular case, as you look at synthetic and you go back to your organization, for us sitting at the front, right? I know that we are spending endless amounts of hours trying to get to the bottom, understand the patterns, try to get the use cases or intent, as we might call it. But there is going to have to be action for us collectively to solve for this particular problem. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody,
How are you?
Yeah, good time.
Hi.
Yeah, that was fun.
We've been on the phone a couple times.